Okay, let's talk about Jesus Christ. I know it's getting to be somewhat of a sensitive subject nowadays, but I think we can openly talk about the reality of this situation that we have in front of us and the belief system that goes behind it. I've been watching in the background the last couple of years, went back through it again. I found a few people online through YouTube that have their own channels, and they're taking scholars on to end up discussing finer points, certain things, aspects about the whole idea and concept. Really, by doing it, went through the whole concept, have went through the washing machine, if you will, and see if they can find any change, the whole 9 yards. And in doing so, it all fell apart again. And I've been looking at certain ones of these people are sharing their experiences of how they left the religion as far as believing that it's true. And in fact, in a strange way, in doing so, they're actually deeper into the subject and now going around and exposing the certain facts that they found out that ended it all and let it fall apart. And in most of these people, they found that whenever they studied the Bible, just like Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens once said, if you want to go away from the religion of the Bible, just read the Bible itself. In other words, don't go to church and let them skip through and tell you things, because they've got a little motive going on with that, and in doing so they skip over all kinds of ideas. A strange one I was able to point out to my ex-wife and a lot of different people that didn't know, whenever we see the cartoon Shrek and you see all these fairy tale creatures, right, that are associated with that, but then there's a talking donkey's one of the main people, and you don't remember any talking donkey stories. Where's that all come from? Because these are all mythological creatures. Well, yeah, that's the talking donkey of Balaam. It's a magic, forever living donkey that can even talk and see angels and all kinds of things that they report with that. Of course, any story that has this type of thing with talking animals and things in it is definitely mythology. And so a lot of times whenever you go to church, they're going to steer away from talking about Balaam's talking donkey. And if they do, they've already, and I've seen them well expressed, that they've got their own little view on it that tries to save their butt or cover it up with some type of idea. You'll find that the people that try to claim that this is the unerring word of God in that Bible are the ones that steer away from it the hardest, like Calvinists and so on, because it can't fit. And then you see they've already made the comment that if one of these things falls apart, then all of it falls apart. Which is strange, but then again, whenever you realize it, yeah, because it makes you start going, well, if this is definitely untrue, then what else in here is untrue? And see, the reason it falls apart is if you try to go into it and figure out what really happened and what was going on at the time, you'll find that, oh, well, that's not true either. Oh, wait, and then this, hold on a second, and this whole story that goes on here is from somebody else. And the whole Moses beginning idea is from Sargon the Great and all of these other things, and it'll really fall apart. And for me, it fell apart a long time ago. And really, wanting to know the truth of it and the reality of it, I got deeper into it and started listening to some of these scholars I'm talking about. And in doing so, I found out, wow, I didn't even think about that aspect, but that's another one. Here's another one too. Wow, it's an amazing book. How it's woven all these things together, and a lot of pagan beliefs and ideas and concepts. As I've shown this last year, a lot of the Greek hand in the Bible, showing you that there are parallel stories And it gets to the point that you can't deny it. Whenever three things in a row happen in succession and they mock each other. But then it goes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then this lady's name is actually the name of the word concept in washing of Jesus' feet, if you watched my video on that and so on. And that's just one little aspect thrown in there. And people nowadays have taken to try to say, well, the old Bible was great, but the new one was created like what you're talking about. And it's like, no, definitely not. And then, of course, the new Bible's built on the old one and trying to confirm that, but then build on a 2.0 situation. And so if that's invalid, the other's invalid. I thought I'd talk about a couple of key points here. I watched something and it got me to thinking about it, and well, it was just a phrase a guy used in there and everything, kind of to dissuade apologetic in any situation. And in doing so, I just had to pause the video because thoughts started running through my mind. The coffee's kicking in, and I'm like, oh wow. I haven't thought about this concept in a while, but I put together 3 or 4 things. I don't know if I'll be able to do it to you without saying "and things" and not mention it correctly. I'll go through, but kind of touchy here. But we're led to believe that this is God, right? And to most people who have looked into it at all, it makes no sense that this is God and it's the Son of God, and God had to kill himself to make up and sacrifice himself to make up for all of the sacrifices people had already done in his name. And it looked like it was a fix-up of the situation, that the first God was a little bit too rough, and then he changed his mind. And then all of a sudden it's this young guy and it's his son and so on. So it's the same pantheon growing situation that you see in all of the other pantheons. Only this one's supposed to be true, and to make up for it, to try to make it seem like they're all one, Jesus and the Father and the Mother, who is talked about as being the Holy Spirit now, are all one. Well, that's a family idea, and because of that family idea, you may be able to get something out of that, or a belief and concept about how my dad and my mom got together, and then I'm the conflagration of both, where Jesus is actually put together like an ancient tale of Asherah and so on. So, wish we quit doing that. So here we see Jesus in a lot of his depictions, and of course in a modern day they've tried to turn the idea of him being a Caucasian Jesus into an idea of current demographics that are in the Near East, which is strange, because in all my studies it shows you these people didn't have that demographic and that phenotype even back at that time there. Even earlier art doesn't show it, but you can see other art where they'll show everybody's got dark hair, everybody's got this, everybody's got that. The only known description of Jesus says that he was really not a 10, ladies. Had chestnut-like hair like this, which looks a lot like mine. It would get a lot blonder in the sun and have some darkening down into it and so on. You know, Jesus is a gala priest. Yeah, see, the people have all this thing about he was just some kid who grew up in a podunk town, and all these narratives that are all built into this idea. But whenever you break it down and people get into it, they tell you that this may not have ever even happened. But if it did, what they're talking about is somebody that's a gala priest. So more akin to what we think of as a druidic type priest. Gala, like Galatians, like the Sea of Galilee, have to do with Gauls. And so maybe we can get an understanding that, yeah, that is more what he looked like. I remember when I was a kid, and I had already figured out that a lot of it's bullshit, but hopefully the kernel of the story was somewhat true, or there was some type of magic thing that was going on. And in my investigations in doing so, they ended up taking one time, somebody figured out that you see these holes in his hands, this stigmata, if you will. They showed this idea, and then they found out that that couldn't hold up a body, and that that's not even the way that they did it. So this showing of an idea of stigmata, and everybody's certain of it, and Jesus showed his wounds in his hands and all of this type of thing, would have never happened. Also, whenever they sacrificed somebody like this before and put them on a cross, this was already going on before Christianity. You see this concept that's in there led to an idea of Christianity, but this whole cross idea was nailing somebody to it. And whenever they did, they didn't ever take them down or do anything like was said that was done with Jesus somehow specially. They were actually left on that cross to rot. And that people would have to see this as an example. They wouldn't go through all the trouble. But if they did it through his hands like this right here, he would just rip right off and fall off the thing. Wouldn't have worked. Not the way that they did it. And of course, the way they treated this guy, joking about it and so on, it's got to be not taken true. But then the whole idea of maybe the centurion that turned around and switched right there and said, surely this is the Son of God, which somebody, of course, just threw that in the story. That like, oh, he died, he was able to just knock off whenever he wanted to, or what is this story or this idea? Well, they took a pig and they tried it with it and a cadaver, and lo and behold, it didn't work. And they would have nailed somebody through the wrist bone so it held on to it, and usually they wrapped them around with a sinew, and then it took a few days usually for somebody to go down. It wouldn't have been just like Jesus in a couple of hours. I mean, what are we led to believe here? Versus even the possibility of what was going on at the time. I'll just let that stew in your ideas for a little while here. But the idea of somebody dying and rising 3 days later, this is in all kinds of pagan tales leading up until this point. And it's why they stole that idea and put it in there. Because the sun, which Jesus is a symbol of, as shown here, as him coming up as the rising sun. The sun, whenever it reaches the solstice, which Sol is the sun, and stasis is to stand still. So solstice means for the sun to stand still. And whenever you're measuring the thing with astronomy and so on, it's constantly moving 1 degree per day. That's how we get the 365 degree concept, but it's moving 1 degree per day, and it slows down and then stops. And it doesn't appear to keep going or start going back for 3 days, and then all of a sudden it does again, to save all of mankind. It's a symbology that's thrown into this thing in ancient sun worship, which I've shown a few years ago is where all religions started off at. And with agriculture and things like that, it woven into a way that's the thing that we see today and the concepts we see today. But that came out of sun worship and things, and then the agricultural hooking up to the sun and the seasons, the 4 cardinal points, everything. In fact, that cross there is really a symbol of the ancient astrological staff, which can also be used to build pyramids and do other things and develop angles. It can actually be a partial sextant. Let's go with something totally different. Just set that on the shelf for a minute. Again, we're going to start over. This is supposed to be God, and it's God and God's Son, but still God, but all those things and whatever. And if you can get over that, then we still have that there. But I don't know if you're aware, but the same thing happened to Caesar whenever he died. That 3 days later he was risen again by Venus, which was his guardian angel, if you will, and took him up into heaven. And it had happened a lot more times than that. And of course, variations on a theme of this story gives different weight to each one of them. So none of this is really new. In fact, the story of Jonah and the whale, and you'll find that in the Bible, some stories get repeated over and over again, or there's this motif woven into it that's way back at Moses too, again. Like this crossing of waters and all these concepts. When it starts to roll through it again later in the story, they start doing it pretty much in order again. And of course, you're supposed to see and understand that motif, but then see the extra stuff attached to it and make another revelation and so on like that. Again, it's a complicated book and it's got a lot of neat things into it. And this is one way of showing you that this wasn't some farmers and fishermen that came up with this idea. This was done by a very literate people that had already written a lot of the other stories for us. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about Yahshua. And they go, yeah, well, that's Jesus. No, that's actually Joshua. There was no J back then. That was supposed to be the recoming or the returning of Joshua. And if you'll look into the Jewish or Bible, Old Bible situation, he's supposed to come as a warrior and all that stuff. But whenever the Bible was written with Jesus, they turned around and said, no, he's coming real soft to try to fix everything. But then when he comes back again, he's coming back as a lion. Right? Which people have been waiting for over 2,000 years. And it hasn't happened. I did a video, well, not too long ago, a few months back, just showing you these prophecy ideas of whenever he's supposed to come back. Well, believe it or not, these scholars that I talked about, whenever you look at something like this, they discuss the fact that Paul and everybody back then was actually saying it's going to happen right now. In fact, Jesus says it's going to happen during the lifetime of the people that are standing in front of him. Surely I say to you, verily I say to you, those in front of me right now will not taste death. And that wasn't some curse that they're going to be a vampire that lives forever until he makes a decision. He was telling you it's happened during that generation. Well, he's telling you about something that already happened, and it's weird that people wait for something that already happened as if it's going to happen again. But did it ever really happen? I mean, one of these stories, of course, there's so much conflagration in between Mark, John, Luke, Matthew, the stories that are, there's totally differences there. And then a lot of these scholars have realized that, well, they started with this premise and these other people know that one, but then there's this other Q source that we don't have anymore really, that everybody hid from us and burned away pretty much. But in doing so, that Q source is the extra stuff that's in these that we no longer have the gospel of, as some of the other stories. And then at the last one of John and stuff, they try to figure it all out and fix it. And it tells quite a different story. In fact, the story that you have in your mind is generally picked between all four of these gospels and what they say here versus there. Almost like these apologetic or preachers are making a story up out of the four different ones which do not have the same story in each one of them. It's also how we get the Christmas story that we have, because that's not even really written about. And Jesus' divine birth and situations like that aren't really referred to until they got to the point, well, if they're going to make him into all this, they've got to have this pagan crap attached to him. So he has this virgin birth. But then again, here's another good question. Well, let me just go on to another picture if I can. Here he is supposedly coming out of the tomb and all that. The stone was rolled away. Well, if you look into it, in the stories there, which one are you looking at? Because either there was still centurions there and an angel, or there wasn't anybody left anymore, and there was just a gardener in one story, and then the other one it's different. Or you can go to simple as how many ladies showed up and who the hell were they, and did they tell anybody or not? Because the original story tells you they did this and then they didn't tell anybody and ran away scared. And then you're like, well, how did anybody ever find out then? Leaving you with an open narrative right there. So let's go with another concept here. Set all of that aside on the shelf so you've got these different things to think about. But let's take this idea from its origins again. It's supposed to be the Son of God and this, that, and the other. But what they did was he made him a human by going through a virgin woman and having a baby. See, this virgin idea is the way they can prove that it wasn't from somebody else or from Joseph. And they play up this idea like the guy's going to be real happy with a girl he's betrothed to marry having a kid from someone else. I bet that was a difficult conversation to have. In fact, when they try to do it, it still doesn't ever come across as believable, really, in most people's minds, or a lot of people's minds. But is he a god? Or is he a demigod? See, this story has connections to ancient Sumer, and like Gilgamesh, where he's part divine. And I've made other videos showing you that there are sacred twins, and that one of those would have been from the dad, but the other one's from the gods. They didn't understand twins back then. They put this special thing onto it. Or like Alexander the Great had two different colored eyes, a blue eye and a brown eye, and they said, well, his blue eye shows his divinity, so he's half divine, and his mother did this, so he had heterochromia, and that's another weird thing, you know, that you can stand out and say, aha, something's very different about him, and so on. But isn't that a demigod? Make no bones about it, when we describe things like this is either in your Bible, they have the idea of the Nephilim, where the angels came down and did this, not God. So here's a weird conflagration too, an idea, and they ended up having sex with women, and those ended up becoming the great men of old. But they talk about them being giants too, because there was all this mythology with these giants and people, and now we get an idea too of this Gaulish type priest idea, because there were a giant concept in those. But as I've shown you before, all of these religions have this idea onto it woven in, along with a flood and other ideas. And a lot of people have realized, including myself a long time ago, this has a common origin, and it must go back to earlier than and spread out with people like a story, like a trend. And how does this work? And it ends up working itself back to Proto-Indo-Europeans. So when somebody's sure that Jesus looked like this, we end up getting 4 or 5, 6 connections. And even if it's not true and all made up, the made up story was that it was like this. Know what anybody tries to pull on you nowadays, where they try to apologetic their way out or into something, or then just saying, well, Jesus was a mix, or Jesus was this, or trying to include all these other people that really in that story aren't included. It's just a very local story. It had nothing to do with the known world. Even when they refer to that or the nations, it's all what Jesus can see from sitting on a little hill here. It has nothing to do with Eskimos or Orientals or Sub-Saharans or anything like that. It doesn't refer to them necessarily at all. But now again, would not this be a demigod? Because see, demigods are Nephilim types, where you end up having a god breed with a lady, and so she's half human and half other. And this is supposed to explain how there are some people in this world that just stand out. And that must be by the gods, you understand? There's some people that, like Einstein, it's like somebody, the goddess of wisdom, blessed Einstein, da-da-da-da. You see how this works? So after the fact, if this was hundreds of years ago, if not thousands of years ago, people would have said, well, he's hooked up to Minerva and all these things with this goddess of wisdom idea, or Inanna, or in, how this all works. And who would have been his connection to the heavenly idea. Just like I explained to you before in other videos, that when we talk about this sons of God situation, everything going on, it was the only way for Caucasians to explain to themselves how they became so advanced compared to even other people and so on. There has to be someone's hand in this, and because we're the most advanced happening here on the planet, it's hard to understand why we're not a monkey, or we're not just like the cows or the horses and things. Why are we so different? And other than that, why are we so different than these other people that we even know about? And so it was explained with this alien idea. But that also might lead to a cargo cult concept where something like that actually happened at one time. People still wonder where Rh negative blood comes from, and this concept that works through Cro-Magnons, which lead to these same people we're talking about. And the answer for that was, well, the gods came down, and that was all the people that you hear about before Jesus, and everybody that did great things were these people that were caused to become demigods, like Gilgamesh. And in the story of Gilgamesh, he ends up taking over the situation. But if you look at the concept of Marduk, he really takes over as being the main god, right? He takes over as being the main god of everything, and everybody else is an underling. Like, they become angels all of a sudden, and he becomes the real ruler of all. It's the same thing that happens with Yahweh, because we look in the story and there's a whole council of gods and all this type of situation, and he gets twisted and turned over time, and angels and then saints below them who are godlike, who must be some like connection, special hand upon them, created in a special way. Man, if people got an extra little snap, they must have something to do with the gods. If somebody's great at war, Mars must be behind them, and so on, right? And not the planet, the god, but aren't they one and the same in the concept and the way we put things together? So I ask you again here, when everybody else has these Gilgamesh, who is part god, or all these other people, that's really looked at as being a demigod. That's where, well, Mom was real sacred too. See, just like Mary, right? To where that's how she got chosen. And then they knew that if they chose that one, and then they had sex with her or whatever, which sometimes was just a sprinkling of glistening of dew or all these weird little concepts, that she'd become pregnant and end up having a kid that was fantastic. Usually these stories got written after the fact, and they end up becoming a story that was made up about their childbirth and everything. And there are stories about Jesus' childbirth, where he's playing with his friends and gets out of hand and kills his friend, and he goes and raises him back up, and then the friend freaks out, realizing that he's a god now. But see, that's one of those books that got thrown out. They don't want to have that idea because you don't realize it because you don't read the Bible. But they try to, in one story, say that it happened during the baptism that happens with John the Baptist and so on, and because the bird flies down and da-da-da, this is my son, da-da-da, he says in this, well, that makes it to where that happened then. But then later there's an epiphany situation and a changing that Jesus goes through, and that ends up morphing into a son. So is it this time or that time? And so they didn't want to say that it was revealed whenever he was a kid, so they didn't like that idea. The other story that's along with that too is he's making little clay pigeons that people can buy and use that on Sunday when they go to church, in the place of a real pigeon, which is in the place of a you, which is in the place of a oh no. But then whenever the man comes up and catches him working on Sunday, which is taboo, right? You know, blue code law and so on, that, Jesus is in trouble. And Jesus just claps his hand, and the clay pigeons turn into real pigeons, See, this is a morphology just like humans got turned into, so Jesus can do these same things. Da-doonch. But they just fly away. Clay pigeons turn into real pigeons and fly away. And he's like, what are you talking about? This is kind of Jesus going against some of the laws here, or doing things that are a little out of character. And they didn't want to have that, though, did they? So I ask you again here, is he a demigod or a god? Because if he's half from a mortal woman and so on in this situation, he's a demigod. And then, of course, if he's a demigod, then he isn't God himself and so on. And then there's this weird thing in a cartoon story that you got to come up with to try to make it into a correctness. Or was this God came back on this planet or whatever? No, that didn't really happen. In fact, here's a strange thing. They call it a sacrifice, where he had to sacrifice himself. And every time we did it, we lost something forever and all that. But whenever he did it, he didn't. He just popped up in heaven and he's like, ta-da! So he didn't sacrifice anything. He didn't lose anything. In fact, he gained from it. So this isn't even the story that we had before, is it? Doesn't quite sound like what they teach you in Sunday school, and of course there's a reason for that. But this is what a lot of those theologians have been coming up with. Also on the idea that Paul was telling you, men, go ahead and sell your house right now and everything. This is about to go down right now, during our lifetime, da-da-da. Well, if you look, whenever that got written, that was already a lifetime after Jesus had already said it's going to happen during our lifetime. A lifetime is 40 years in the Bible, a generation, whenever they had to walk in the desert for a generation with Moses to get over that crap and then go into the Holy Land. That was 40 years they walked in the desert, right? It's a sacred number. It also goes with Enki too, by the way. But that 40 years concept is put there in a generation. So whenever Jesus said that, and he died in 33 AD, 40 years from that it'd be 73 AD, and that's whenever the temple fell and the whole thing that he was talking about. Of course, it was written after the fact, so it's like me making up some mythology that goes with World War I, knowing what we know now. But then he becomes a demigod, doesn't he? And this doesn't quite fit the narrative that we're even tried to give in the first place. And then you go, well, here's the definition of demigod, and he fits that. He doesn't fit the other one. Well, but his human part died, and then he turned into total God. Well, is he a half person when that happens? This doesn't make any sense. Oh, it's all special and different. God works in mysterious ways. Leave it alone, because it'll ruin the whole thing if you keep going into it. Oops. Marduk becomes the council over the whole thing. They tried to do that in Egypt too with the Aten and so on. And a lot of other cultures have ended up putting somebody ahead. And strangely enough, this went as a blanket across the whole thing. And everybody else already had a Jesus type thing that had been put off into their histories and their mythology. But then all of a sudden, storm gods become the leader of everything, right? Because it used to be Enki. Enki means Lord of the world. And he was a trickster god that could pull off things because there had to be a trick to make us where we are now. So he got us to a certain point, and then they rewrote the whole thing, and they said it was Enlil that was doing it, and he's pulling off a Marduk thing. But then they take the original story that was from Enki, give it to Enlil, and the Marduk story, he's the one that kills Tiamat and then puts her body to cause our canvas above ourselves, to cause the stars and heaven and all of this idea later, isn't it? And Zeus ends up having that same concept. Watch my series on storm gods. In that I go kind of into it, and how there's these common tropes that go with it too, and everybody's got them going on. All the way from India, all the way to Scotland and Ireland, just like the Proto-Indo-European linguistics and so on. And now we could talk about Tower of Babel and how that works and what that linguistic would have been in earliest of days. But then the timeline doesn't fit quite correct. It goes back to earlier than the Bible actually says the universe existed somehow, because people ended up taking things as literally. Just thought I'd share this with you. It came to mind, and 3 or 4 things kept attaching it into it, and I kept thinking about it, and I go, why not? So I thought that I'd put this out there. Is Jesus a demigod? When he rises again in 3 days, is that any different than all these other pagan stories? And in fact, is that the reason they use the same story? When they didn't have a date for it, but then they were certain that it went on December 21st, and then the other date was for Easter. And that shows an exact connection to these beliefs going with these agricultural gods like Osiris and all this from the Wayback Machine. People putting him right in that seat. And then trying to play it off, well, to make people believe it a little better, we threw in some pagan stuff, or we adopted it like Christmas. Last Christmas I showed you where you can still see in the zodiac and the constellations the whole manger story right there. Yeah, here's a donkey and a bull, there's these animals and so on. It all works right there. I also showed you God and his holy seating arrangement where he's got it at. And in the same zodiac, I can show you, oh, here's the Jason and the Argonauts. Here's the Argo. Oh, by the way, that's also the Ark. Yep. The whole story, a lot of times, is written in the stars. It's while they're certain, even though it sounds weird to you, they're certain of it because it worked off of puns of words, and this is the one that fits, so that must be the story. And believe it or not, that's how we got some of this. And that's where the Greek stories come from too. And who started all this? Well, the earliest known that we got onto it is the Sumerians, but people that have been way into this look at it and they go, some of this is going from way back in the last ice age and further. There was really no proof until we started having different cave art and so on, and then finding Göbekli Tepe, and all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, so it does connect and go back, just like people were saying. Anyhow, I could just probably go on and on and on as this coffee keeps kicking in, but I think I'll let it go from there. But I guess one of the key points here was, well, 3 or 4 I wanted to throw in, but then the story of God, that's a demigod, right? Because it's through a mortal woman, whether she's a virgin or anything freaky like that. It still works that way. Oh, just like Hercules and other these stories that go along, it's not even really different. Well, sure, it's unique and different. Well, they all are a little bit, aren't they? No different. Except for in Jesus' case, they threw a few of them together as a conflagration. And then tried to say, well, that's God, but God is a man, but God is this, that, and the other. You know, they said whenever Jesus rose again and the carpet tore and all those things happened, that the undead came out of their tombs and they walked the streets, and a lot of people saw it and all this. Well, if it's only in your Bible and it's not in all these people that were around during that time telling you about this marvel where people actually did come back from the dead, you see, that had been written about till today. Oh my gosh, if it ever happened like that, they would never shut up about it. But nothing was ever said. And even though the books said it, then nobody wrote about it. Isn't that crazy? And they have all these guys at the time that are into his stories and stuff, like a Herodotus character, all in this area telling you all about it at the time. At least 60 of them they found over time that would have referred to something like this, people that are keeping track of stuff and mentioning, and there's an easy possibility for at least 60 people to have said something about it, but they didn't. In fact, these 16 or 18 people that are documenting everything and all that never made a mention of any of this happening. I made a video around about Christmas and I just left it alone. I felt like I was kicking a dead horse, but I made a mention in the video about how what we believe of Jesus is a bunch of stuff we've piled onto him. Now we've put a suit on him and everything, and he's Santa Claus, or modern adult Santa Claus stuff going on with all these different things from Asclepius and different ideas that really weren't even in that until much later, and people wove it into this idea of where it is today. Kind of crazy. But I guess key point on this one, guys, wouldn't that be a demigod? I mean, it's okay that it is, but it does ruin the whole story about he's God, but he's this, but he's that. he kills himself, but he's still in heaven, but then he does, and then he goes to heaven, but he's in heaven, but he's, how does this all work? He has to kill himself to right himself from the crap that he put upon us that we couldn't do in the first place? Well, believe it or not, men have set standards since before recorded time and put up an idea like they had in their minds of like, one day we'll get all like this, and set that as a standard for people and goals to reach. And believe it or not, we've reached past those goals so many times. As I mentioned when I was talking about my Atlantis type video, they're really putting stuff that they have right now as the newest cutting stuff and saying that's what they had, plus a little bit of magic to make some things happen. Just one step further. Just like when Sitchin tries to do his thing about Sumeria, he still gives them space rockets running off fuel and all these ideas that probably really aren't in effect. It doesn't work well or correct. Does it? Anyhow, not to beat a dead horse, but did you know that Jesus' earliest depiction, on a cross too, by the way, shows him as being a man with a donkey head, like Seth of the Egyptians? I made a whole series about Seth and his connections to the Old Bible, the Old Testament, and what they said was in the Holy of Holies. Almost a reverse Egyptian concept, blatantly going against it. Like it's not like this, it's like that. That little twist right there. Let me know what y'all think down below. I'm just going to go on to something else, and I'm going to grab breakfast. Peace.